Harley Davidsons are ridden all over the world. They're an American icon. They're about as American as apple pie. In 1903, four young men had a plan to put the world on two wheels. The three Davidson brothers and William Harley launched a global marketing wonder in a shed behind their home. But for years, the bad biker image gave Harley a black eye, and the competition was pretty tough. It got so bad the company almost went under. But a few true believers swore they'd never let Harley die. They put up their own money and went to work. With the help of thousands of loyal customers, they saved an icon and a legend, Harley Davidson, one of the world's dream machines.
I think that there's a few things that are so American that they can't miss.
Today, the Harley-Davidson motorcycle is one of the most well-recognized products in the world. It is sold and ridden on every continent and in almost every country. Like Coca-Cola and Levi's, it has become one of the most popular American products.
So it's a mystique. It goes beyond borders.
%30 of the more than 150,000 Harleys produced every year are shipped to customers waiting overseas. Some have waited for years. Before you can join the throngs of Harley loyalists, you may have to stand in line. The bikes have become so popular, there might be a wait for a new one from the factory. Harley could build more bikes, but they say they don't want to sacrifice quality. It's not a bad position to be in for a manufacturer. But it hasn't always been this easy for Harley-Davidson. In fact, it's taken almost 100 years for Harley to become the leader of the pack. Around the turn of the century, bicycling was a fad in America. It seemed that everywhere you looked, people were hopping onto their bikes and riding off, often in packs.
Bicycling is something that is hard to think of in the present relative to the way it was in the past, because it was so immensely popular at the turn of the century. There were millions of bicycles.
The bicycling craze attracted the attention of a number of young entrepreneurs, including the Wright brothers. Wilbur and Orville would give up biking for their airborne adventures. Another set of siblings, the Davidson brothers, Arthur, Walter, and William, along with William Harley, were interested in keeping their wheels on the ground. In 1901, they began a quest to improve the bicycle.
They wanted to take the work out of bicycling. So they wanted something that was a little bit stronger. So they set out to make something more powerful. They said it was not for any commercial venture, but because of laziness.
They were people who were adventurers, and they wanted to go someplace reliably, but they wanted to go someplace as fast as the technology of the time would permit.
Bolstered by the optimism inherent in turn-of-the-century America, the Harley-Davidson venture went ahead in 1901. Working out of the family garage, it took 2 years of constant work on engine designs before they were happy with their efforts.
Their first carburetor they made themselves, reportedly out of a tomato can. They said their first spark plugs were as big as doorknobs and cost $3 each, and by 1902 standards, that's a lot of money.
The main problem at the time, really, besides, of course, engine technology, obviously, was to create a frame that was going to work.
By 1903, they finally had an engine, a new looped frame, and they were ready to go into production. Their first effort used a single-cylinder engine that was based on a proven French design. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was reliable. The real breakthrough was the looped frame. Instead of just mounting the engine on a standard bicycle frame, they'd created a new frame that cradled the engine. It was a much more stable arrangement.
Once that engine met that frame, the Harley-Davidson Motor Company had motorcycles that were powerful and durable.
Like all of their early motorbikes, the 1903 had a bicycle crank, pedals, and a leather drive belt. To start one, the rider would pedal the bike while it was still on its stand.
You'd get it up on the rear stand, and you'd retard the spark a little bit and give it a little belt, and that's tightening it up, and start to pedal it over, and with everything in good working order, it'll start.
You kept pedaling until there was enough engine compression, then you soared away under power.
It was pretty much ahead of its time. They run well, they pull good and strong, and they're a lot of fun to ride around on.
They decided to call their venture Harley-Davidson because Bill Harley had the idea first of building a motorcycle. Production was slow initially, but they kept at it.
They built, in their very first year of production, in 1903, they built 3 motorcycles. The very next year, in 1904, they made a similar amount. By 1905, they made 16 motorcycles. 1906, they made 50 motorcycles. So they were growing slowly but steadily.
As the business grew, the backyard shop doubled in size. In 1907, Harley-Davidson was incorporated and production soared to 150 motorcycles. Development didn't slow. Bill Harley was working on perfecting a 2-cylinder engine. After a false start in 1907, he had something ready for release in 1909. The new 45-degree V-twin engine was introduced.
They went to the V-twin first to produce more power, obviously, because it's twice the displacement. And the V-twin is a logical engine to use in a motorcycle because if you look at the frame, it forms a V naturally. So the engine cradled very nicely in there.
It displaced almost 50 cubic inches, and its 7-horsepower output propelled a motorcycle at the lightning top speed of 60 miles per hour. Speed was more important than ever, since car makers were now determined to compete with motorcycles in the low-cost transportation market.
The stress was put on the motorcycle as competing with an automobile for reliability and for durability, but also offering something that an automobile would never offer. The sense of adventure, the pioneering mentality.
To make motorcycles seem exciting, Harley-Davidson sponsored a race team dubbed the Wrecking Crew. They became known for their death-defying board track racing.
It was a very dangerous type of race. It was raced on the board track that was designed out of 2x2s or 2x4s stacked on end, and the actual degrees of the bank turns were up to like 60 degrees, so even if they had to do the repairs on the tracks, they had to take a ladder and lay it up against the track on the turns, climb up the ladder to do the actual repairs to the track.
These were tricky courses for the riders. Making the transition from straightaway to banked curve at speeds up to 80 miles per hour was difficult at best and sometimes deadly.
When they did have accidents on the track, it was usually because a couple of racers bumped into each other, and normally they would shoot off the track into the crowds, which created a real problem. Once they did wreck, it was usually fairly tragic and pretty much fatal for the racers and even a few of the audience and participants of the race. So the board track racing didn't last very long.
When board track racing ended, Harley's wrecking crew moved to dirt tracks.
They were very successful in the races, and from 1915 on, they were the people to beat.
One of the Harley riders adopted a baby pig as a mascot. He called it Hog. The name Hog became forever associated with Harley Davidson. The fame generated by racing success spurred sales. The simple but reliable little machines the company first produced in a backyard shed positioned Harley Davidson for a bright future. Harley Davidson was on the road to growth and prosperity. Its racing program kept it in the news and stimulated sales. To stay ahead of the competition, the company was dedicating some of its profits to engineering and product enhancements.
It took a while to get the bike moving. They needed a chain to get the back wheel going to start the motor, then it would gradually engage the belt, which slipped because it was leather.
Leather belts were known to slip when it rained, and they would slip if too much power was applied. With the advent of ever more powerful engines, it was time to try something else. After several years of experimenting, Bill Harley developed a chain drive that was ready for sale on the 1912 models. A few years later, in 1916, the Kickstarter was added.
Basically, instead of having to run with the bike, get it started, you stood still and used your leg. And of course, you had to be careful because sometimes that, could have slipped and then you could have had a sore knee or something.
The pedals were no longer needed. Motorcycles had finally broken away from the parentage of the bicycle. But many people still relied on their bicycles for transportation and for work. Arthur Davidson was determined to prove to government officials that motorcycles could replace bicycles at the post office and at many other government agencies.
Harley Davidson was always looking for other ways to market the motorcycle, and they marketed it to the U.S. Postal Service. And by 1914, the U.S. Postal Service had some 3,400 Harleys delivering mail, primarily in the rural areas.
The military was also attracted to the rugged and fast bikes. General Blackjack Pershing had been sent down to the Mexican border to capture the Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa. Villa had been raiding towns along the U.S. and Mexican border, and President Wilson was determined to put a stop to the violence.
Of course, they were on horses, the bandits, and they're hard to catch. So General Pershing sent a telegram to Harley Davidson, said, "We would like some motorcycles down here." That very day, Harley Davidson put, I believe it was 12 Harleys on a railroad car and shipped them down to General Pershing.
The motorcycles were equipped with a sidecar gun carriage that served as a machine gun platform. Even though Pancho Villa wasn't captured, the motorcycle had proven its worth, and when America entered World War I, it was drafted.
In 1917, before most of you fighting men were born, our fathers fought the First World War to make the world safe for democracy.
Harley Davidson in 1917, at the beginning of our involvement in World War I, was supplying about half of its motorcycles to the military. But by the end of the war, all of Harley Davidson production was going to the military.
More than 20,000 motorcycles were sent overseas before the end of the war. Most were used for scouting and dispatch duties.
Because at that time period, communications were very poor. They didn't have walkie-talkies, telephones weren't widely in use. The motorcycles were used primarily as dispatch vehicles. They would take messages from one army to another.
The motorcycle, the plane, and the tank mechanized the battlefields of World War I. When the war ended, Harley-Davidson's employees joined the celebration and looked forward to the future. By 1920, they were producing more than 30,000 motorcycles a year. They were now the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world. In the 1920s, the country's spirits were up. While booze was illegal, no one seemed to notice. People wanted to have fun. Harley-Davidson thought they would roar along with the times, but business began to slide.
There were some ups and downs, and a lot of them were based on the economy of the time. There was a depression in 1920, I think late in the year, which actually put some of the manufacturers out of business.
As part of Harley's survival plan, styling was emphasized. Harley-Davidson introduced the now familiar teardrop gas tank.
And they started advertising that as the streamlined look. It was supposedly more aerodynamic, it looked better, it looked faster.
They also sold the benefits of Harleys to America's police departments.
Police departments in America began to look at the Harley-Davidson motorcycle as the ideal vehicle for law enforcement.
By the middle of the decade, more than 1,400 sheriff's departments and state patrols were using Harley-Davidsons.
As a pursuit vehicle, the motorcycle was ideal simply because it was so nimble and able to chase down a car. It would be faster than an automobile.
By the 1930s, motorcycles were favored by highway patrols all across the country. Riding in rain and snow on dangerous and slippery roads made the job hazardous, but many clamored to become motorcycle officers. There was a certain romance in the profession. Boots, breeches, and saddlebags gave the motorcycle cops a Wild West look that thrilled young boys and struck fear in the hearts of speeding motorists. Walter Davidson had recognized the allure of the motorcycle look. During the down days of the 1920s, he launched a campaign to sell Harley-Davidson accessories and clothing. Some was more practical than stylish. Engineering wasn't overlooked. Other features were added. A larger engine and a real breakthrough, front brakes. Production crept back up. By 1928, over 22,000 motorcycles were produced. Optimism returned. But this attitude was premature. Panic set in when Wall Street crashed in October of 1929. The boom went bust. Businesses closed. People were let go. Unemployment zoomed. Harley had to struggle once again. The effects of the stock market crash took a while to reach Harley-Davidson. The company started the decade of the 1930s on a high note. Sales were up and new products were hitting the streets. The biggest news was the engine, called the Flathead. It provided more low-end acceleration and a sleeker profile. The bikes could now be built lower to the ground. But the bike had mechanical problems. Customers began to desert before the engineers could find fixes. By 1933, Harley sales were down to just under 4,000 bikes. To reverse the slide, Harley worked on its problems and decided to give the bikes a facelift.
The 1933 Harley, instead of having the previous olive-colored gas tanks with crimson stripes and block letter Harley-Davidson, now adopted this very Art Deco-ish tank design of this real graceful pinstripe that came up into a stylized eagle. And instead of being olive, they came out in colors like black and red. Very exciting.
These bikes hit the road and started to drive up sales. By 1934, sales climbed back to almost 10,000 units. They would remain there until the end of the decade. Sidecars were emphasized to increase sales.
I believe that the sidecar really was there for adventure and fun. And the idea was to expand the fun of owning a motorcycle.
But some found that bikes with sidecars could be a little dangerous to operate.
Corners can be tricky because when you're going around a corner, you know, your two wheels are operating at a different speed than your third wheel, than your sidecar wheel. You know, it's a different breed of animal. It's a hybrid. It's not a bike, it's not a car.
Development continued, and in 1936, the EL model with a 61 cubic inch overhead valve engine was unleashed.
And it was in a totally new motorcycle, had a new frame, new gas tank, new fenders, new suspension, new seat, new transmission, new oiling system, twice as powerful. It was entirely new, and it was a big breakthrough for Harley Davidson.
The knuckle-like look of its cylinder heads earned it the nickname Knucklehead. This engine produced almost double the horsepower of the flathead. Overall, the bike was shorter and more graceful. On top of the tank sat an integrated cluster of instruments with a cat's eye look, a popular feature in many subsequent Harleys. The styling trends, like the shape of the gas tank, that started with these bikes became a Harley-Davidson tradition. In Europe, the Germans were building fast and reliable motorcycles. These bikes had a different cylinder configuration than American bikes like Harley-Davidson. The opposed cylinder heads put the cylinders out to the sides of the bike and provided more efficient cooling. The bikes also had shaft drives instead of chains. These durable and powerful bikes caught the eye of the German military. In the latter part of the decade, motorcycles were pressed into service by military forces all across Europe. Motorcycles rode with Hitler's panzer divisions when they launched the Blitzkrieg into Poland. The bikes were fast, maneuverable, and capable of advancing where cars could not go. They were becoming an integral part of mechanized warfare.
I think the military really looked at Germany closely and how they waged war and saw how they used motorcycles, among other things, airplanes, etc., and tanks, and really started to modify their own forces to kind of copy the way the Germans did it.
The U.S. military saw how the Germans were using motorcycles and they were impressed. Not only with the tactical use of the bikes, but with the bikes themselves. They asked Harley-Davidson and others to build a replica of the BMW.
Instead of having a V-twin engine, it was a twin where the cylinders were fired side to side and was a shaft drive. And that was developed for use by the Army in the North African campaign, because a shaft drive in the sand would perform better than a chain drive. The sand tended to eat up the chains and the sprockets, whereas a shaft was all enclosed, it would perform better.
They paid the companies $870 for each of the 1,000 bikes that were built. The XAs performed well. They had smooth, balanced engines and got about 35 miles to a gallon. The extended cylinder heads kept the engines about 100 degrees cooler than Harley's Knucklehead. Over 6,000 miles of testing produced very few problems. But the North African campaign ended before the XA could be field tested, and Harley's tried and true models were sent rolling toward the front. Harley-Davidson, along with all other Americans, was pledging its allegiance to the country's war effort. All motorcycle production was dedicated to America's fight for freedom. People would have to wait until the war ended before any new Harleys rolled down America's roads. Harley Davidson sent thousands of motorcycles to the front and turned many GIs into fans. They showed the world how to ride.
Sunday, December 7th, 1941.
The United States entered the war when Japanese planes turned Hawaii's Pearl Harbor into an inferno. While the fires burned, Harley Davidson began to convert its factories to support America's fighting forces. It was a gargantuan task, but there was no other choice. It had to be done. As American boys lined up to enlist in the fight, Harley Davidson stood proudly beside them. Harley Davidsons were pressed into service by the U.S. Armored Divisions for eventual use in reconnaissance, to probe for enemy mines, scout for ambushes, secure bridges, and to establish forward positions. The motorcycle would augment each division's 400 tanks and 300 scout cars to form a truly mechanized armed force. The training for motorcycle combat duty was rigorous and dangerous. These motorcycle troops became modern-day Rough Riders. They were no longer just the messenger boys they'd been in World War I. Their 8-week training course taught them to ride on rutted roads, up steep hills, and over the worst imaginable terrain, all at top speed. In a tank attack, the motorcycles were to follow or lead the tanks, riding at full throttle with their machine guns roaring. They had to be prepared for ambushes and be able to instantly change course without missing a beat or a shot. This was tricky work that explains why the motorcycle riders became frequent medical corps customers. They proved their value in combat and served on all fronts and all theaters.
In fact, when the Russians were advancing on Berlin from the east and the rest of the Allies from the west, the Russians had 30,000 Harleys in their army at that point.
The wartime exploits of the dashing motorcycle riders gave the bikes a bit of cachet at home. Movie stars like Clark Gable, Ward Bond, Gene Tierney, and Tyrone Power all bought Harleys and soaked up some of the growing motorcycle mystique. The celebrity fascination with Harleys would continue after the war. By the end of the war, Harley had sent over 90,000 of its Army version motorcycles overseas. From the front lines to the military police, Harleys had pitched in. After the war, many returning GIs wanted to let off some steam. They went looking for romance and adventure. Some found it on a Harley Davidson.
But a lot of them also were used to riding hell-bent for leather. And when they got into civilian life, got back on a motorcycle, that's what they did. They rode flat out, they opened up their mufflers, they raised a little bit of hell, because that's the way they were used to riding.
Some GIs were able to pick up surplus Harleys for next to nothing.
A lot of the GIs came back and they wanted to get these surplus bikes at reasonable prices they could afford, and they went out and formed clubs.
The most notorious club, the Hells Angels, got their start in Southern California right after the war. It's said they took their name from the 358th Bomb Group that had been stationed at Molesworth in England. The 358th attained quite a reputation as fearless aerial warriors. After the war, the name became associated with motorcycling's outsider image. Harley and motorcycles had been on the receiving end of some pretty bad publicity. Many became convinced that motorcycles were only for outlaws. But the image wasn't all bad.
There's that rebel image that really helps us because of that, it creates a mystique, I guess.
It added a little thrill to motorcycling and allowed the average consumer to feel like they were flirting with danger. It was kind of exciting.
Oh, there's no question about the fact that outlaw publicity helped sell motorcycles. Yeah, absolutely.
Films like The Wild One, Angel Unchained, Angels Hard as They Come, Born Losers, and Cycle Savages beckon moviegoers with titillating promises of sex and daring motorcycle riding. The formula sold well and packed the theaters across the country. Outlaws and movie producers weren't the only ones attracted to Harleys in the 1950s. Rock and roll's teen idol Elvis Presley took one of the first checks he received from Sun Records and bought a Harley. Harley had been enjoying its position as the preeminent American motorcycle manufacturer, but it was feeling some pressure from overseas, especially from England.
Harley Davidson saw the British invasion out there. It wasn't rock and roll back in those days. It was motorcycle, it was Nortons and Triumphs and BSAs and so forth. Those bikes handled good, they were faster, they were lighter.
To counteract the British threat, Harley introduced a new bike in 1957, the Sportster. It is considered to be the father of the super bikes. The Sportsters were more powerful, lighter, and had better handling than any Harley ever built. They quickly became a very desirable ride.
A Triumph motorcycle was a Triumph motorcycle was a Triumph motorcycle was a Triumph motorcycle. A Harley Davidson was that and more than a machine.
At the dawn of the 60s, Harley Davidson sensed that there was a need to diversify to meet changing consumer needs. Its big bikes and the biker image were under siege. In the early 1960s, Honda launched an assault on Harley's home turf. Their ads trumpeted the fun and innocence of their bikes. They promised that you would meet the nicest people on a Honda. This was not the message that the public had been getting about Harley Davidson.
Well, yeah, you meet the nicest people on a Honda, and that in turn kind of inferred that maybe you don't meet the nicest people on a Harley.
College kids and young adults flocked to the Honda scooters and small bikes. They were fun, inexpensive, and surprisingly well built. Harley Davidson had to scramble to meet the challenge. To beat the competition at the dealership, Harley needed more capital to expand and to diversify.
I think what Harley Davidson needed more than anything else was some money at that time to expand their manufacturing capacity, because, you know, way back then, as today, there were long waiting lines for Harley Davidson motorcycles, and they needed to expand production.
The company began looking for a partner. In 1969, Harley Davidson merged with the American Machine and Foundry Company, AMF, who were known for making bowling balls and other leisure products.
It was a huge investment on AMF's part into Harley Davidson and into the future of Harley Davidson.
Harley Davidson hoped they'd thrown a strike with AMF. As the 60s came to an end, news events, films, and television programs helped Harley keep the company in front of the public. They turned Harleys into heroes and icons for a generation.
Forgive me for saying it, but I think Easy Rider has something to do with it. Well, I like the image, and I designed the bikes, and I thought this will look cool, boy. Let me tell you, they were a bitch to ride, the one that I was riding. It looked great, though. I built two like Dennis's and two like mine. I designed them, and friends of mine and myself built them. And we had a good time. So cool, man.
Even though they were building the choppers prior to, in the 50s they were coming out with the bobbers, but the 60s you were getting the stretched out front ends, the chrome this, the flame that, you know, and they were getting quite elaborate, and it was just getting much more flamboyant through the 60s.
These wild bikes were built by customizers, and some at Harley-Davidson didn't like the fact that they rearranged what the factory made. But one of the founder's grandsons, Willie G. Davidson, took the opposite approach.
This show down here is very important to Harley-Davidson because these guys are really creating some beautiful works of art. And there are some ideas down here that we can use in our production motorcycles. And I think it's very important for me to understand these riders and know what they're putting together.
He saw what the customizers were doing and decided that Harley-Davidson needed to get hip. He convinced the company to build factory customs.
I had to do some internal convincing. Number two, there's risk involved in any new model regarding its acceptance in the marketplace.
He took the heavy frame and running gear from one model and mated it with the lighter front end of another.
He really began this tradition that Harley-Davidson has developed of creating a factory customized bike. The kind of motorcycle that if you were good with your hands and you really knew what you were doing, you'd want to do yourself.
The result, the Super Glide, became a real collector's item. He continued to reach out and stretch the limits. He created a factory lowrider and a real beauty dubbed the Cafe Racer. This sleek black bike was a style setter that showed the ability of the designer, but it wasn't a hit with the Harley riders. They wanted more of the lowriders and big cruisers. Harley-Davidson was looking forward to conquering a new decade in the 80s, but quality problems plagued the company.
Well, in the middle 70s, when this total redesign of the product line began, there were a number of product problems. The motorcycles were generally unreliable. There were the stereotypical puddle of oil underneath the motorcycles wherever they were parked.
It was kind of hard back in those AMF days to be a salesman or a dealer as a Harley-Davidson dealer and look somebody straight in the eye and tell them, hey, buddy, you're never going to have any problems with this bike, because you knew darn well this guy was going to come back in with some major problems.
The relationship with AMF was not what some had hoped, including AMF. They were being advised to dump their leisure time products and return to making heavy machinery. This meant an unknown future for Harley-Davidson.
AMF made a strategic decision that Harley-Davidson didn't fit in their long-term plans, in their long-term portfolio of companies. And they tried to sell it.
There was one small problem with that approach, and that was there was nobody that wanted to buy Harley-Davidson. So I guess after about a year of looking for a buyer, and AMF looked everywhere, I guess the only people who believed the Harley-Davidson's story were the Harley-Davidson people themselves. And one thing led to another, and our CEO at the time, Vaughn Beals, put together a leveraged buyout and said, well, we believe in this company, let's us buy it.
Well, I remember back when Harley-Davidson took control again of their company, the first thing I could remember is seeing the magazines of the AMF signs coming down off the Harley-Davidson dealers' buildings. You know, they blacked them out, whatever, and it was a great celebration that Harley-Davidson was back in control.
Production had slipped to 41,000 bikes, but there was hope that Harley could climb back to the top.
Some of the fates were stacked against us, because no sooner had we closed the deal, and now we were the proud owners of Harley-Davidson and $85 million of debt. The bottom fell out of the motorcycle market in the U.S.
Harley was on the brink, but the new owners vowed to press on. To survive and to grow, they knew Harley had to make the best bike possible. Manufacturing processes were improved and quality became more than just a slogan. But it would take some time for the public to realize that Harleys were really changing. They were banking on the loyalty of their hardcore customers to carry them through.
We were making motorcycles that basically needed to be fixed right out of the box. And our riders stayed with us, which was amazing, because they wanted part of Harley-Davidson. They wanted to ride the Harleys.
Harley Davidson always had the diehards, the people that would not ride anything but a Harley Davidson.
But loyalty only goes so far, and Harley execs knew that time was short. In 1984, they bet the company on their new Evolution engine. Quality was up, and there was an optimistic outlook on the future.
Steve Dealey walks into my office and says, you guys can go public. I said, Steve, what do you mean? You're nuts. We can go public. He says, yes. 4 months ago, we're worried about bankruptcy. We're worried about being put out of business. And now the same investment banker is telling you, go public. You're positive net worth now. We had never been positive net worth until that time.
That same year, Harley Davidson was approved for listing on the New York Stock Exchange. It was the sign that Harley had changed. The company was being lauded as the turnaround kid. It was celebrated in all the august business publications, and its executives were being invited to give seminars to many Fortune 500 companies. But most importantly, its loyal fans knew Harley was back.
It makes me proud today to be a Harley Davidson dealer, because I don't have to make any excuses, because the quality is there as good as anybody else's or better.
New products kept popping out of the factory, and willing buyers were lined up waiting. Today, it's hard to imagine that the company was ever in trouble. When it sponsors a charity event like the Love Rides for Muscular Dystrophy, more than 20,000 dedicated riders will turn out on their Harleys. Legions of celebrities are devoted Harley fans who donate their time to a good cause as well as spend a day riding their bikes. Harley has established itself as the world's most famous motorcycle. It attracts thousands of loyal customers to its product every year. It's a phenomenon that many people have tried to explain.
You know, Harleys tend to be sort of evolutionary rather than revolutionary, to quote their advertising. And that's why people form a kinship with it, you know. I mean, you can have one just like your father had.
The Harley has there's just something about it. I think it brings out the best in what is an American. You know, it makes you feel independent and maybe just a little bit adventurous, and it's a great bike.
You know, it's when everybody ever thinks of motorcycle, the first thing they think of is Harley. And it's like the sexy motorcycle that all the really, really cool masculine men drive and stuff. It's sexual.
Quality is up. People are buying bikes, and Harley has taken off. And more women are riding Harleys.
I think there's a lot more women riding now, and a lot more women interested. Don't want to ride on the back anymore. They want to be in charge.
It's clear Harley Davidson and its riders won't stand still, but no one knows if it will continue to be an icon or whether it will just become another product. To ensure that Harley stays in touch with its roots, and some say its magic, a great deal of attention is paid to what has worked in the past. The more changes that are made, the clearer it becomes that the legacy of Harley Davidson is its true value.
There is no other motorcycle in the world that represents this kind of sensibility, this pioneering sensibility. That's the same today as it was in 1903. That hasn't changed. And that is part of what we call the Harley-Davidson mystique.
Recognizing the importance of its heritage, Harley-Davidson is determined never to forget its history as it rides into the future. Harley-Davidson is a phenomenon. It's not just a motorcycle, it's a way of life. It's also the comeback kid, a company that convinced many that America could once again compete in the global marketplace while having a good time. It doesn't get much better than that. Truly, they are dream machines.